Hello everyone, this is Rogers Harrison with another episode of the Deep Sports Deep Dive Podcast. As always, the Sports Deep Dive Podcast is coming to you commercial free because we know that you've got a lot to do in your day and you can't be hanging around listening to commercials. Also, if you listen to this at the end of the day, you also want to go ahead and listen and get your day over with, I guess. So we welcome you and glad to have you here. So we're going to talk about the NCAA Basketball Tournament. The history that we will discuss is about the men's tournament. We can discuss the ladies' tournament at another time. So we're going to get things started. We're going to go all the way back to 1936. So in 1936 was when the Met Basketball Writers Association was formed, known as the MBWA. Now that was known as a group of journalists covering college basketball in the metropolitan area of New York. And they are known for their prestigious Lieutenant Frank J. Haggerty Award, which is presented annually to the top player in the area. Now, their primary goal when they were established in 1936 was to recognize and celebrate the excellence in college basketball within the metropolitan area. And again, that is New York City. So they were founded in 1936, and they decided, you know what? We're going to put together a little tournament at the end of the season. And so in 1938, the postseason National Invitational Tournament was formed, the NIT. Now that was 1 year after. So 1937, the NAIA tournament was created by Dr. James Naismith. And that name may be familiar to you because Dr. James Naismith is the one credited for inventing basketball. And it was also 1938 when they created the NIT, was 1 year before the NCAA tournament was formed, which is our subject today. The first NIT was won by Temple over Colorado. Let me go back and clarify this for you. James Naismith created the NAIA tournament in 1937. The NIT was created in 1938, and then the NCAA tournament was created in 1939. Now, when it debuted in 1939, it only consisted of eight teams, each selected from a geographical district. So you had like a southeast team, a northwest team, and so on and so forth. By the way, the first tournament was won by Oregon, and it was the idea of the Ohio State coach Harold Olson at the time. And the National Association of Basketball Coaches operated the first tournament for the NCAA. So what we have here is we've got two college basketball tournaments, the NIT and the NCAA, which is not being operated by the NCAA. And that, of course, would change. So from 1939 to 1950 is when you had those only eight teams being represented. Now, So because of that, because you only took 8 teams and created a tournament to crown the national champion, the NIT was very, very popular because the NIT had some pretty good basketball as well. Because now so keep in mind, think of the current 68 NCAA tournament as this is being recorded. We are preparing for the first 4 of 2025. That will be tonight. But think of all the good teams that are not in the top 8, meaning all the teams that did not get a number 1 or a number 2 seed in this year's current NCAA tournament. Those are some pretty good teams. And if you were a fan of those teams, you might watch the NIT instead of the NCAA from 1939 to 1950 because your team was part of the NIT probably back then and wasn't one of those top 8. So keep that in mind. All right. So then the tournament expanded to 16 teams, and that started in 1951. Now, for the 1952 tournament, there were 4 regions. Now, before 1952, there were just 2 regions, an East and a West. But for the 52 tournament, there were 4 regions: East 1, East 2, West 1, and West 2. And they were all played at separate sites. So remember, the first one in 1939 was played at and won by Oregon. But now we're expanding. We got 16 teams now instead of 8 for the 52. Starting in 51 and then for the 52 season. So, all right, so you've got 16 now in the NCAA tournament. The NIT is still very popular because, as you know, there's some pretty good basketball teams that, that aren't in the top 16. So, that type of thing. So now we're starting to expand a little more and 53 tournament expanded to include 22 teams, added a 5th round with 10 teams receiving a bye to the regional semifinals. 10 teams receiving a bye to the regional semifinals. That just seems crazy, but it happened. And then the number of teams will fluctuate from 22 to 25 over the next 20 years, but the number of rounds would be 5. Remain the same. The double of the region name was kept until 56, meaning East 1, East 2, West 1, and West 2, until they were renamed East, Midwest, West, and Far West. In 57, the regions were named East, Mideast, Midwest, and West, and that was the standard until 1985, when you had what they are today, which is East, Southeast, Midwest, and West. I believe the women's tournament still uses that Mideast moniker, but I'm not sure. And like I said at the top of the podcast, we're not talking about the women on this particular podcast. That's for a podcast. That was for a podcast later. So let's move on to what is considered the modern era. So we're in the 70s, and now the 80s. In 1971, the NCAA added a rule that banned teams who declined an invitation to the NCAA tournament from participating in other postseason tournaments. All right, so this is because the NIT was so popular, and they were like, well, I'll just go play with all these other good schools in NIT, and I won't care about the NCAA tournament. And that's what they were doing. They were declining the NCAA tournament, and they were going to the NIT, which seems crazy to us today, because the NCAA tournament is where you crown your champion, your number one. All right, so also in 75, the NCAA started allowing multiple teams. And this was because there were several highly ranked teams being denied bids in the 70s. So in 75, they said, well, all right, more than just your conference champion can come to the NCAA tournament. South Carolina in 1970 was undefeated in conference play, and they were in the ACC at that time, but they lost in the ACC tournament. Maryland, 74, ranked number 3, but lost in the ACC tournament championship game to eventually North Carolina champion North Carolina State. To eventual national champion North Carolina State. So that was one of the reasons why a lot of these teams were going to the NIT, is because good basketball, as well as they were denied going to the NCAA tournament because of that rule. People like Maryland, people like South Carolina in 1970, before the NCAA, or USC in 1971, had before the NCAA initiated that rule that if you declined an invitation to the NCAA, you couldn't participate in another postseason tournament. So people, but until 75, when they said, all right, we'll have multiple bids from one conference. So we're moving on now. In 1985, the tournament expanded to 64 teams. And by doing that, it eliminated all the byes. And so nobody went in with a bye, because now we're up to 64 teams. And for the first time in 1985, all the teams had to win 6 games to win the tournament. And of course, this led to popularity within the American people, and it led to increased media coverage. And that's where all the March Madness terms were created, and all that, all that good stuff. So the 68-team format, which is what we have today, was adopted in 2011, and that's when the first 4 was created, and Dayton has hosted it ever since. And there's talk that they might expand it even further to maybe something like 72 teams. And if that were the case, there's talk that they would have the first 4 in other places other than Dayton, Ohio. But Dayton has hosted it. Their fans seem to go out there and support it very well. Dayton, Ohio is home of the University of Dayton Flyers. So a little side notes. The the NCAA canceled the 2020 tournament because of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, initially the NCAA discussed holding a shortened version with only 16 teams in the Final Four host city of Atlanta. But once they realized, the seriousness of COVID-19, they scrapped it altogether. And making the first edition never to be held since it was born in 1939. And they also decided, well, rightly so, not to release the brackets that this selection committee was working on. I would like to, 5 years later in 2025, I would have liked to have seen those brackets. I would have liked to have seen what they drew and what they came up with. Just curious about how they had people projected and seeds and we could have done our own little March Madness and predicted who we thought was going to win in 2020. So that's a brief look at the NCAA tournament intertwined with the NIT tournament. It's very, very popular today, and wanted to get this podcast out here before the tournament starts here in 2025. I hope you enjoyed this version of the Sports Deep Dive podcast. Be sure to leave any comments or questions on the platforms that you listen to this podcast on. We will be back with another podcast next week. Until that time, so long, everyone.